So welcome to Brown Bag History, March 13th, 2023. Today, 2024, thank you. I will fix that. I'm still in the wrong year. As we start, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Snacks homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So today it's the topic is tragedy at Priest Rapids, and it's a story going back to the fur trading days back in 1838. And the Columbia River was first mapped by David Thompson in 1811, completed his multi-year survey of the Columbia River and produced maps of this region. And that opened up the fur trade on the Columbia River. That continued up until the 1850s. Their travel route was over the Athabasca Pass from Jasper over the pass to Boat Encampment at the top of the Big Bend, and then down the river to Fort Colville, and then even on to Fort Vancouver from there. So this was an incident that happened in 1838. I've also seen it referred to as the tragedy at Death Rapids and the tragedy at Little Dalles. So there's always been a little bit of confusion about where it actually took place. But I firmly believe that it happened at what's known as Priest Rapids. So this is a map that was produced in 1940, the map of the Big Bend Highway, which opened that year. And here you can see this top arrow is where Boat Encampment was. So the traders would come down the pass where the Wood and Canoe rivers flow into the Columbia. And that was his post that he established there in 1811, and it was used by the fur traders on that route as long as the fur trade was running on the Columbia. And when you come down the Columbia past Gold Stream, and then there's a series of rapids in between Gold Stream and Downey. And the most well-known of those rapids was Death Rapids, and it's marked here. And then just below that was Priest Rapids. And based on one of the descriptions of the incident, and it was a contemporary description, it was one of the people that was actually in the party that had gone ahead of the group that was in the accident. They were describing it as the rapids directly below Death Rapids. So I believe that it was Priest Rapids, which wasn't named at the time, and I believe the term priest applies to two of the people in the fur trade party that was coming through the river at that time in this group. They were the first two priests to come on that route onto the Columbia River. So that's sort of setting the scene there and letting you know that that's where I think it happened. So the account that I'm mostly using comes from a book called Historical Sketches of the Catholic Church in Oregon by Francis Norbert Blanchette, and it was published in 1883. And this is Francis Norbert Blanchette. He was a priest that was sent out to come to what they referred to as Oregon Territory at that time. And he was one of the people that was with this group of travelers when they came. In his book, he talks about what they call the Catholic Church in Oregon, and said that in 1824, Dr. John McLaughlin was the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, was appointed governor of posts with headquarters at Vancouver, Washington. And under his direction, a number of employees of the company were supplied with provisions and farming implements to enable them to settle in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. So in 1834, the first wave of immigration reached the shores of Oregon. It included some Methodist and Presbyterian ministers. And in this account by by Blanchette, who was obviously Catholic. He said that these ministers came under the ostensible purpose of securing souls for the Lord's vineyard, but in reality to secure large tracts of land, large bands of cattle, and to enlarge their numerous commercial speculations. So he was suggesting that their motives were more economic than spiritual. Blanchette claims that those Protestant missionaries left, in quotes, left the Atlantic slope under the hallucination that they were called to preach salvation to those that sat in darkness and in the shadow of death, but whose trading propensities overcame their religious zeal until finally the cause of Christianity was wrecked on the shoals of aggrandizement. So by the 1830s, there were 16 settlers in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, and they wrote to the bishop at Red River, Manitoba, to request a Catholic priest to minister to them. Most of them were French-Canadian former fur traders. And so the bishop wrote to McLaughlin indicating that he would send someone as soon as possible, but they didn't have any priests available at that time. So in 1835, the Bishop Provencher wrote to the settlers in Willamette Valley, said, "I have received, most beloved brethren, your two petitions for missionaries to instruct your children and yourselves. Such a request from persons deprived of all religious attendance could not fail to touch my heart. Remember, my dear brethren, that the proper means of procuring to your children and wives some notion of God and the religion you profess is to give them good example by life moderate and exempt from the great disorders which exist among the Christians beyond the mountains." And the only way for them to get priests out at that time was through the Hudson's Bay Company fur trade routes. And so the bishop applied for the passage of two priests in one of the canoes to Oregon. Sir George Simpson, who was the president of the Hudson's Bay Company, wrote to the Archbishop of Quebec in February of 1838, indicating that passage would be available for two priests in April of that year. So the Archbishop of Quebec gave charge of the mission in Oregon to Reverend Francis Norbert Blanchette of Montreal, and his companion was to be Reverend Modeste Demers, who was already at Red River. Blanchette was born at Saint-Pierre, Rivière du Sud, Quebec in 1795, and was ordained a priest in 1819. He was appointed as missionary to the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq Nation for 7 years, and then given the parish of the Cedars on the St. Lawrence River. And Demers was born in Quebec in 1809 and ordained a priest in 1836. So they had both been born in Canada. They received a letter of instructions from Joseph Signé, Bishop of Quebec, in April 17th of 1838. And I'm not going to read the letter verbatim. It contains language that I will not use. But you can probably assume in the way in which Indigenous people were referred to by Catholic priests at the time. But the instructions were to minister to the Indigenous people of the region and baptize them as Catholics, to tender their services to the wicked Christians living in licentiousness and forgetfulness of duties, to baptize Indigenous women and substitute lawful marriages for what they refer to as irregular unions, to learn the native languages and prepare written grammars, to establish schools and catechism classes, and to plant crosses to take possession of places in the name of the Catholic religion. And that was going back to a doctrine that had been in place really since colonization of North America. It was referred to as the doctrine of discovery. And it was basically saying that these places were uninhabited by Christians, so that the church had both the right and the authority to take these lands and to take possession of them and to impose Christianity on the populations and claim the resources of the land. And that doctrine is still considered by Indigenous people to sort of being the sort of overarching doctrine that's created the what was known as the Indian Act and the residential school system. So they're still asking for that to be formally revoked and removed from the Catholic Church and from any official documents. But that's kind of the context in which these priests were coming out, and that was sort of their mindset. So Blanchette set out from Lachine, Quebec, and made the trip to Red River, which was 2,100 miles in 33 days by canoe with occasional portages. And the journey from Red River so at Red River, he met up with Demers, and the journey from the Red River to the Rocky Mountains, which was 2,100 miles, was made in 84 days, including stopovers. The river route was made in 11 light barges, and the land trip, occupying 5 days, was made on horseback. Horses were used on the tedious trip across the Rocky Mountains from Jasper to Boat Encampment. That took 9 days with 72 horses. And it took them 6 days to make the ascent on the eastern slope and 3 days to descend to the Columbia. And at that point, they had reached Boat Encampment. This depiction of Boat Encampment was a painting by the painter Paul Kane, who was an Irish-Canadian artist who came out on a fur trading trip in 1848 into the West and did a lot of painting in the West. The original of this is in the Royal Ontario Museum. But that is his depiction of Boat Encampment in the mountains there. I'm just going to show you now this photograph of Boat Encampment taken by Earl Dickey in the 1940s. And you can definitely see the shape of the mountains, although Paul Kane, being an artist, exaggerated the height of the mountains somewhat. Flip back, you can see it took a little bit of artistic license there. But that's what the encampment would have looked like at this time. So there was quite a large party of them that they were with. When they arrived at Boat Encampment, the following day was a Sunday, October 14th, 1838. And the Blanchette in his writing said, "It was on that day that the holy sacrifice of Mass was offered for the first time in Oregon at Big Bend on the banks of the dangerous and perilous Columbia. At this great act of religion performed by Reverend M. Demers, the two missionaries, being much moved, consecrated themselves to the Queen of Angels, imploring her special protection for the rest of the voyage." They were alarmed when they got there that instead of the 4 boats they were expecting, there were only 2 boats. And these were big boats. Each would carry 20 people or more, and as well as baggage. But when they got there, they decided that 1/3 of the party should remain at Boat Encampment and wait for another boat to come back for them, while the rest went in the 2 boats to House of the Lakes. And we believe that, so they would have had to pass through Death Rapids on their way there. Said the 2 priests and others set off for House of the Lakes with John Todd, who was the officer in command of the brigade, and most of the voyageurs and freight. They started out at 1 p.m. on October 14th. Blanchette said, "The days are short in so deeply embanked a river, which runs 15 miles an hour in a succession of rapids, or rather cascades. The distance from Big Bend to the House of the Lakes is 165 miles, which were run in 10 hours, 2 hours on the 14th, 6 on the 15th, and 2 on the 16th of October." And the rapids of the Dells of the Dead, or Death Rapids, is a narrow channel turning neatly at right angles on the left rocky high bank. The boats must keep close to the point of the left bank in order to avoid being rushed into the infuriate waves. That dangerous rapid was run down safely on the 15th, the boats being light with baggage and passengers and well managed by 8 men, 6 at the oars, 1 at the stern, the other at the prow, with long and large paddles used as rudders. And he said that this is a photograph showing the upper end of the Arrow Lake, so approximately where they would have camped. We believe that House of the Lakes was at the community that later became known as Arrowhead. It hasn't been definitively identified, but that's what most people believe, that it, just based on their description of the travel and being called the House of the Lakes, it just makes sense that it would have been located where Arrowhead was. They said the boats were no sooner arrived at the House of the Lakes than one of them was unloaded and sent back to the relief of the party left behind. The House of the Lakes being still in construction, the missionaries encamped as usual under their tents. And the other boat left for Colville with John Todd, the factor in there. So the priest said they spent their first week in prayer and celebration of the Mass, and they were teaching the indigenous people, who they referred to as the Lakes, but were the Sinaiacs people, and said that they were singing sacred canticles and doing their evening exercise, evening prayers. Blanchette said that the Sinaiacs were anxious to see and hear the black gown so often spoken of by the Canadian fur traders. He described the Sinaiacs as mild, peaceable character, and well disposed to receive the words of salvation. And said that they brought 17 of the children to be baptized. They said that the adults were sad that they couldn't be baptized, but they had to receive more instruction before they could be baptized, whereas children could be baptized as infants. And he said when excuse me, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat today. So he said, when the day on which the boat was expected had passed without its arrival, a gloomy presentiment began to seize the hearts of all. It increased in intensity the following day. At last, on the 24th of October, at the conclusion of Mass, a boat appeared far off, half broken, coming in mourning, without the usual joyful chant at arriving. The men were hardly able to move their oars. As the boat approached, all ran to the shore. At the sight of so few men, women, and children, a heart-rending spectacle took place. An indescribable scene of desolation and shedding of tears began. Cries and piercing lamentations were long heard and echoed by the neighboring mountains. He said, for alas, the boat had capsized, and out of 26 souls, 12 had perished. At Big Bend, the boat was found too much full with baggage. Room was hardly left for the passengers. At the dangerous Dalles, or Death Rapids, all went ashore with only a portion of the baggage. The boat started, struck a rock, filled, but was brought on shore. Having been emptied and reloaded, the fur packages left in the bottom, having got wet, rendered the boat heavier. The passengers embarked with the greatest reluctance. On the next rapid, the boat filled up again. Then commenced a scene of desolation and dread, with cries and screaming of women and children. And I believe, as I said, I believe that to have been Priest Rapids. The pilot commanded all to remain still as they were approaching the shore, but Mr. Wallace, an English botanist, pulled off his coat, stood up, put one foot on the side of the boat, and leaped into the water with his young wife. The boat lost its balance and upset. And out of 26 persons struggling in the water, 12 lost their lives. Wallace and his wife in the number. Some reached the shore, others were saved on the keel of the boat, which fortunately fastened itself on a rock 3 or 4 feet deep at the head of a rapid. This calamity happened in the dusk of the evening. The body of a child was found caught under the boat. Sad, long, and excruciating was the night. The next day, the boat having been repaired, the survivors continued their sorrowful journey. So the victims were Peter Banks, who was a botanist, and Robert Wallace, also a botanist, and Wallace's new wife, Maria Simpson. Banks and Wallace had been sent out from the gardens at Chatsworth, the estate of Chatsworth in Derbyshire, England, which is the estate of the Duke of Devonshire. And the head gardener was a man named Joseph Paxton, and he was expanding the very extensive gardens there and wanted to introduce species from around the world. So he actually sent two of his gardeners to North America to collect species to be included in the gardens. And those were Peter Banks and Robert Wallace. They were traveling under the auspices of the Hudson's Bay Company. Water, please. So they came out and were traveling across to get to the Columbia River and continue their journeys. And while they were at Norway House in Manitoba, Wallace met Maria Simpson, and they fell in love and got married, against the advice of pretty much everybody, against the advice of the chief factor there. He was really advising him against such a hasty marriage. Maria Simpson was also known as Maria Miles, and she was the daughter of Betsy, who was the wife of chief factor Robert S. Miles. But prior to her marriage to him, she had been in a relationship with George Simpson, who was the president or governor of the Hudson's Bay Company. So she was actually a daughter of George Simpson. And they were two of the people that died in the accident, along with Peter Banks, the other botanist. Another man who died was Pierre LeBlanc from Red River. He had been hired out in the service of the Hudson Bay Company as a joiner, and three of his children also died. Pierre LeBlanc's wife was Nancy, also known as Matuski. She was Chippewayan. Her mother was Chippewayan, and her father was fur trader Roderick Mackenzie. She'd been previously married to J.G. McTavish, who was an officer of the Hudson's Bay Company, and had children with him. But their relationship was what was known as a country marriage, so it wasn't considered legal. And what happened often was the fur traders would return to England or Scotland and bring back wives with them and abandon their country wives. And that's what happened both to George Simpson's country wife and to McTavish's country wife, Matuski. But Simpson did try to make sure that the women were taken care of, and he usually did that by finding them other husbands. And in this case, he found a husband for Matuski, who was Pierre LeBlanc, who was a carpenter in St. Boniface, Manitoba. So they had children together as well. So they were traveling out to the Columbia River fur trading posts as a family. He was going to be relocated here on the Columbia River, and but one of their children, I think a 5-year-old, actually died during the trip along the Athabasca River and was buried by the river. And they continued on, and then Pierre and the 3 remaining children died at Priest Rapids. There was a little bit of discrepancy in the records. I saw accounts saying that 2 of their children died in the rapids, and one child, who was a child from her previous marriage to McTavish, survived, and that they both went to Fort Vancouver, where they were looked after until the daughter married and took Matuski into their family. But other records say that the 3 children who were remaining all died in the accident. So I haven't been able to figure out which was the actual account there. One of the other people who died was Jean-Baptiste La Liberté, who was a Métis fur trader from Red River. Fabien Vital, who was of Lachine, Quebec, and had been hired on to come out, and Andre, a man named Kenneth MacDonald, and two children of Andre Chalafour, who was the pilot of the boat. And Andre Chalafour was a fur trader who had been previously stationed on the Columbia River, probably at Fort Vancouver, and had married a woman named Catherine, who was the daughter of a French-Canadian blacksmith and a Chinook woman. So two of their children died in the accident, but both Andre and his wife Catherine survived. One of the children and also a daughter, Rose, survived the accident as well. One of the children who died, their son Michel, was just a few weeks old when he died. Once the boat arrived at House of the Lakes, the Sinaiacs men in a canoe were sent to Colville for a boat and provisions. Their provisions were running very low at that time. They'd lost some of the provisions in the wrecked boat, and what they had there at the House of the Lakes wasn't enough for everybody, so they were having to ration their remaining food. And then the boat that was in the accident was repaired and sent back up to the scene of the accident to search for bodies. They were only able to recover the bodies of 3 children, and they were buried at House of the Lakes with wooden crosses placed over their graves. This photograph was taken at Arrowhead in 1898, and we believe that to be the site where the burials were. It's not where the later cemetery was built in Arrowhead. That cemetery was farther back and is still accessible. But this cemetery would have been closer to the bank of the river or the head of the lake. And I saw an account saying that it was disturbed when there was a spur track put into one of the sawmills in the area, and the crosses were removed. But we believe that to be the site of the burials. The express boat, which had left for Colville on the 16th, had returned, along with the Sinaiacs boat, which arrived with more provisions. And that gave them 2 good boats to continue their journey south. They left House of the Lakes on November 3rd, 1838. The remainder of the journey from Big Bend to Fort Vancouver was made in light boats down the Columbia River. And Blanchette and Demers lived the rest of their lives in the Columbia area, in sort of Oregon and Washington area, and continued to minister there. But just to end up, I'll let you know of our couple more upcoming events. Film Friday is on March 22nd, showing a film called This Never Happened, That Never Happened. It's a 78-minute documentary on the First World War internment operations in Canada. Most of the people who were interned were Eastern Europeans, a lot of Ukrainians, and other people from Eastern Europe. And then our next brown bag history is on the Petty Glacier Mine at Camborne. And that's going to include a lot of photographs from a recent collection we got in, some really stunning photographs of that region. So I encourage you to come to those as well. I'll just close this up. And just need to close this.